Welcome to Food Psych, a weekly podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, and body liberation. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm a registered dietitian and certified intuitive eating counselor. Join me as I talk with interesting people from all walks of life about their relationships with food and their bodies.
I remember I was teething, little gums bleeding, cried every evening, it was all about eating. When I became a teen, it was all about beef, and now I'm ready for the world, trying to sink my teeth in, stacking it.
Hey there, welcome to episode 112 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I have an amazing guest for you, someone I've been wanting to have on the podcast for a very long time, and we finally made it happen. I have Jes Baker on the show today, and for those of you who don't know Jess, she is a writer, blogger, and speaker who has a blog called The Militant Baker and a wonderful first book called Things No One Will Tell Fat Girls. And she's just fantastic. She's a really powerful speaker in this space, and she preaches the importance of body autonomy, self-love, mental health, and strong coffee. And she's really here for intersectionality, and standing up for everyone in this world to have respect and to feel valued regardless of their size, shape, gender, ethnicity, ability, age, or health records, which I really love. I think she's a powerful voice for intersectionality in this movement. And she also has some great perspective on some of the nuances of body liberation. She talks about why she likes the term body liberation rather than body positivity. And so we got into that, and we also got into some of the nuances of these conversations that have been going on recently around body autonomy and people's rights to do with their bodies whatever they want, and how to square that with the ideals of this body liberation movement. So I can't wait to share our conversation with you in just a moment. It's a really good one. And before I do, I want to answer a listener question from this week. So you can submit your own questions at christyharrison.com/questions. And I should say a quick disclaimer before I answer it that these are intended for informational and educational purposes only, not to diagnose or treat any medical condition. Question comes from a listener named Caitlin who writes, thank you for this podcast. It has literally changed my life. I think I'm doing pretty well with intuitive eating so far, but I'm really struggling getting started with intuitive movement. In the past, I have enjoyed, and they mentioned some gym type forms of fitness. I won't say them here to avoid triggering anyone. I've enjoyed those forms of fitness, but always use them to, quote, get a good workout. And I want to try them again, but I'm afraid it will trigger those thoughts. It's like, diet mentality thoughts. Even thinking about it makes me a little anxious. Do you have any suggestions for how I could start getting back into these activities without triggering myself, or alternative non-gym activities I could try? Cannot afford a membership at the moment, other than yoga. So this is a great question, and it's definitely very common for people to have this experience of, feeling like you could easily be triggered back into using movement as an instrumental exercise as opposed to joyful movement, right? Because if you've had that kind of relationship with movement in the past, the wiring in your brain to do it again can be very strong. And so the first thing I would say is don't push yourself to do these forms of movement until you're ready. And maybe that means walking away from them for a long time or potentially for the rest of your life. Like if you are triggered back into the diet mentality and feel like you're using certain forms of activity as compensation or to justify your eating, that is going to be a process to sort of undo the entanglement of certain forms of activity with those thoughts. And especially when it comes to gym-based activities, because the gym is sort of designed for instrumental exercise, right? Like that's its purpose. Gym culture evolved sort of in tandem with diet culture, right? Gym culture is very much a part of diet culture. And to find a gym or a space to engage with fitness and movement that has nothing to do with changing your body or feeling like you're making it into more of a quote unquote good body or socially acceptable body, that's extremely hard to find. It's very hard to find spaces that are gym type settings that don't have a lot of the diet culture baggage around them. So it may be a good idea to step away from gym style activities indefinitely. And that is something that I've seen many of my clients do. That's something I have done. I haven't set foot in a gym in probably 7 years or something like that. So it's totally possible to have joyful movement in your life and not do it in a way, in a setting that could be potentially very triggering. So, that said, if you do find down the line that you're really missing those activities and you're wanting to do them from a purely joyful place, that's one thing. But it sounds like right now, the fear or the apprehension that they're going to be triggering is very strong with you. And that might be something to listen to. That might be your intuition telling you, like, hey, this is probably going to be a triggering situation and let's stay away. So try to listen to that instinct, right? Trust that and step away from those activities. You do mention that you don't want to do yoga, right? That, you're asking for non-gym activities other than yoga. I would encourage you, I don't know if you have an aversive reaction to yoga, if you've tried it and really hated it, or, if there's some issue with yoga for you, but I think the benefit of yoga, the best thing about yoga for people who are recovering from these instrumental types of relationships with movement is that it teaches you a new way of relating to movement. So doing yoga could be sort of a stepping stone for you to getting back into a more joyful relationship with movement. And if you treat it like that, if you sort of put aside maybe some judgments you have about yoga or some bad experiences you've had in the past and think of it as a way to kind of retrain your brain in thinking about moving your body, it could be a very therapeutic and helpful tool for you. And of course, I say this just having read your question, not knowing anything about your body's particular abilities or disabilities, perhaps. So if you have any, injuries or disabilities where yoga is contraindicated, then obviously this doesn't apply. And, I should say too, with all of this advice that I'm giving for this one listener, everybody listening to this is in a different place with movement, right? So some folks might have never had this instrumental relationship with movement and that's not their thing. Some folks might be in it still. Some of you might be listening and engaging in movement from a very compensatory place or in a compulsive way. And so if that's you, the biggest, most important thing you can do for yourself is to try to step away from that, to reduce your amount of movement, to stop doing any sort of movement, even some of the ones that I might suggest, right? So if you're someone who has a compulsive relationship with movement, that's of the utmost importance to cut down on movement and stop using it in that way, right? Easier said than done, of course. It's not like you just stop, but to make that effort is actually self-care for you, right? That's going to contribute to your healing. If you have that relationship with movement right now, the most important thing for you, the best thing for your health really is to stop doing so much movement and ultimately maybe to take a complete break from movement. For many folks recovering from eating disorders and disordered relationships with movement, like stopping intentional movement altogether other than, walking around in your life, like walking to your car or whatever, stopping intentional movement is the best thing you can do for yourself. So if that's you, know that that's what's beneficial to you. If that's not you, if that's someone like maybe this listener who asked the question where maybe they're ready to start recovering their relationship with movement and have cut off the compulsion, they're not engaging in the compulsion anymore right now, that's a time when yoga could be really helpful because it can, again, help you connect with non-instrumental reasons to move your body and how it feels in your body to move. And when you find a good yoga teacher, many yoga teachers teach this, but of course, finding the right yoga teacher, especially for someone in a larger body or of bodies of varying abilities, it's really important to find a teacher who gets it. So you might need to shop around a little bit if you have a few yoga studios in your area. You can also try online resources. I love Anna Guest Jelly of Curvy Yoga. And Jessamine Stanley and Dana Falsetti also have some great yoga classes available on Cody. So I'll link to both of those in the show notes. Those are some great resources. And, if you've been to a few beginner yoga classes, or even if you are just starting out, but you feel comfortable trying things at home, obviously take it easy and don't injure yourself, but you can practice along with those videos. And, that might be a good way to just sort of let yourself take it easy. But however, whatever setting you do yoga in, you're probably going to hear the message again and again that it's not about what you're actually achieving. It's not about doing the poses quote unquote perfectly. There is no such thing as perfection. It's not a competition. It's nothing like a lot of sports that you might have played or gym-based activities you might have done. It's a really radically new way of relating to your body and to movement that, again, can be super, super healing for people who've had that instrumental relationship with movement. So learning to slow down and tune into how things feel, learning how to back off when you're noticing that you're getting tired and give your body a rest when it needs it, having full permission to rest when you need to, and trusting that that does not mean there's anything wrong with you, that there's people in the yoga class who might be doing a really complicated pose, and you're absolutely more than allowed to do the simpler version of that pose or not do that pose at all and just take a rest, right? So that kind of practice is really important for setting the foundation to engage in other styles of movement from a non-instrumental, non-compensatory place. And then some other styles of movement that are not gym-based, but other than yoga that you might want to try or think about trying and see how that feels, see what kind of, thoughts and feelings it brings up. Could be dancing around your living room, right? Or going for a walk, or doing some stretching, not yoga, but just kind of stretching it out in your house. Hiking is a nice one because that helps you get out and see nature and sort of be outside yourself a little bit. So those are a few that are a gentler style of movement that, again, if you're in the sort of compensatory mindset, even those can be very triggering. So anyone who's in that place, don't necessarily do those things. But, if you're not feeling actively compulsive around movement, those are some things that can be a little less triggering than going to a gym or doing activities that are really intensely athletic. But the other thing is, if you had some styles of activity that you really enjoyed as a kid, right? Think about, if you did have any sports that you played or things that you just love doing, like going to the park and running around or swinging on a swing set or something like that. Those are things you could try again now. And, unfortunately for some of us, the diet mentality started really young, and some folks never really had that sort of joyful relationship with their body in childhood. But if you happen to be one of the lucky ones who did have a memory of a joyful relationship with movement and your body before diet culture got its hooks in you, try to think back to what those activities were that brought you that joy, some of the things that you remember fondly doing before you had any sort of rules and restrictions around exercise, and see about trying those now. See if any of those you can relate to in a fun way and in a way that doesn't start to feel compulsive. And I think you'll know, your intuition will tell you, and it sounds like already this anxiety that you're filled with and thinking about certain activities is a strong barometer that, maybe those activities aren't the ones to try. So if you think about trying some other ones and you get that same feeling, maybe those aren't great either. Maybe the activity that you mentioned not wanting to do, yoga, maybe that aversion is exactly what it's going to take to do something, to get into a relationship with a style of movement that's not going to feel anxiety producing. But I think the biggest thing is learning and practicing engaging in movement in a way that's not pushing yourself, that's not expecting anything of yourself, that allows you to honor your body's needs for rest, right? And like certain styles of movement that you might not have thought of. Because, in diet culture, right, it's like it doesn't quote unquote count unless it's structured or it's a certain style of movement, right? It's quote unquote exercise. And so if you're used to thinking about movement in that way, a powerful antidote to that could be just finding things that you wouldn't have thought counted, right? Whatever that is in your own life, however that shows up for you, whether it's spontaneously dancing in your living room or, taking a walk with your partner after dinner and not having even considered that as movement before, but recognizing, oh, that actually is a form of movement that is joyful to me and doesn't feel instrumental at all, right? So look for those opportunities in your own life too, to see like something you might have already been enjoying and doing as, oh yeah, this is movement. This is actually joyful movement, as opposed to instrumental, quote unquote, exercise, which has such a diet culture connotation. So I hope that helps give you some ideas. It's not as simple as like, here are 6 practical things you can do, right? It's more about exploring and thinking about your own relationship with different activities and recognizing what might already be in your life that you hadn't counted as movement before. And then also giving yoga a chance, because I think it's a really powerful tool to help reshape the way you relate to movement. So that's it for this week's question. And if you want to ask a question of your own, you can go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. I also answer tons of questions in my intuitive eating online course, which you can find at christyharrison.com/course. And I want to let you know the price of the course is actually going to be going up August 1st, because I've been adding all of this great new content, including all of these questions that I answer every month. I do a monthly Q&A podcast for participants, exclusively for participants in the course. And it ends up being like an hour to an hour and a half of me answering all these specific questions about intuitive eating from participants. So you can ask your own questions to your heart's content in the course, and I will answer them. And so since there's all this great content and it just keeps growing every month, I've decided to increase the price of the course accordingly. So it's going to be going up on August 1st. So now through July 31st, you can get the course at its current price. Just go to christyharrison.com/course to find out more. And then it'll go up by $100 on August 1st. So it pays to get in there now. All right, without any further ado, let's go talk to Jes Baker. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
That is a wonderful first question. Oh my God.
Right. It's very, very deep.
It really is for almost everyone that I know. I realized in the last year, and this was such a novel realization for me, and it probably is for other people. And then for other people, they're like, obviously, but I never learned how to feed myself ever. Like I still haven't. I'm 30 years old. I work on the internet, reclaiming bodies and our relationship with food and movement and, diet culture and beauty. And I address all that stuff. And I don't know how to feed myself. And that's such a strange realization to have. Mm-hmm. It comes from a lot of different things. It comes from growing up in poverty. I was really, really poor as a child. And that changed it changed for my family when I was in college. So I basically spent my whole life growing up without enough, not knowing where food was going to come from. So an empty fridge to me still causes this very subtle amount of panic. And I don't even fully understand that as somebody who's introspective and has been doing therapy for 8 years and all of that. And I still don't quite understand how deep that is seated in my core. So growing up in poverty, never having enough create the scarcity complex. And then, as I went off to college and started providing for myself, I then had already been and was fully invested in diet culture, which is another form of scarcity. And so my body, my entire life has never been able to trust that there will be food for me. And it's really fascinating. I'm starting to explore it with Dana of Be Nourished. Have you ever heard of Be Nourished?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've had them both on my podcast. They're wonderful.
Oh, they're so great. They're
great. Some
of my favorite humans. For those who don't know who they are, they work with this concept of body trust. And she calls herself, she's a non-diet dietitian, Dana, and Hillary's therapist. And together they work with individuals and clinicians, which is the super important part, to remove fat phobia, fat stigma from our medical practices and focus on whole healing. And so it was a very humble moment for me when I just started only a few months ago. And I was like, oh my God, I don't know how to eat. This is not something that has come naturally to me because I have been talking about health at every size for years. I've been teaching the concepts, right? When I lecture, I am very informed on it. I wrote a chapter on health that was loved by Linda Bacon. Like I get it logically, but on a very core cellular subconscious level, I don't understand any of it. And so after knowing and just assuming that it would be like integrated into my life in this very simple way, and I would just naturally know how to intuitively eat, I realized after years that that's not the case. So my childhood has complicated my relationship with food. Diet culture has complicated my relationship with food, and I don't have one. It's very toxic, unhealthy. If we're going to go, I like to talk about mental health. We always talk about physical health, but mentally it's very unhealthy. And that's okay. I mean, it is what it is. And we're all doing the best we can. And it's not like we owe anyone an excellent relationship with food, but it's something I want to work on. I'm fascinated by it. I'm fascinated by the amount of recovery work that it's going to take to learn how to trust myself, to learn how to overcome that feeling of there never being enough for me in this world in many ways. I mean, it doesn't just stop with food. It stops in a lot of when you don't have money as privilege, power, and freedom. You often feel like there's not enough. So I've been working with Dana of Be Nourished, and I kind of feel like a 5-year-old, some of the conversations we have, where I'm like, man, I can't believe this is a revelation for me. Like, I feel like a 2-year-old knows this, but that's kind of where I'm at with food. And it's been really incredible to start digging underneath, to stop work. You know, I have this privilege of being able to right now not just focus on surviving like I have for so long, but to have like an inch of space to also look at my past and work on the deeper things underneath. So it's complicated. It's tenuous. I'm in the middle of it. I don't really know where I'm going. I just know that I don't know how to feed myself. I'm 30 years old. I'm a body image advocate online. I'm on this podcast and have no idea how to feed myself. That's where I'm at with it.
Thank you for sharing that, because I feel like that's so important for people to hear and understand. Like, you can have such, intellectual understanding of this stuff, and yet to translate into your own life these practices of intuitive eating and health at every size, it's a whole other ballgame, right? It's not just the intellectual knowing is not just enough.
Absolutely. And one thing that Dana shared with me is that that's so common for everyone. You know, we read intuitive eating and we just soak it in. We read it in a day. We're so enthralled with the concept of body trust and intuitive eating and loving your body and health at every size and all of these concepts that make logical sense on the top layer. But that doesn't mean that we instantly know how to practice them. And so I think it's important to talk about, because I was never told by anyone, not that it's anyone else's responsibility, but I want to be the person to share this, that these concepts are wonderful and they give us an alternative framework to exist within. And we must have that. And it's really, really hard. And that last part, I never really heard anywhere. It was just like, here's the solution. And you're like, great, I'm going to be able to do this. And then when you fail, you kind of feel that shame resurface from a different area. And so it's hard. It's recovery work. As someone who's worked in mental health for years, this stuff is painful and long, maybe a lifetime's worth of work. And it's not just something that just like, now that you get it, you do it. It doesn't really work that way. So I'm letting people off the hook left and right for knowing everything there is to know about these concepts and still not being able to implement them into our life, because we're human and that's just the way it works.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's so important to think about also like how long you spent not trusting your body and not knowing how to feed yourself, and like the deprivation mindset was present for so long in your life and is present for so long in so many people's lives that, if people don't have a memory of being an intuitive eater as a child, or for some people, it's like there's maybe a few years of dieting or something like that, and they get a little off track, but they can come back pretty easily just with an intellectual understanding. But for folks who've had years of a different way of being disconnected from your body and being, having that deprivation, and that the socioeconomic realities of it too, right?
Yes.
The privilege of being raised with intuitive eating versus the lack of privilege in not having enough food. It's very hard to be an intuitive eater when you don't have enough food.
Yeah. And, it's so complicated. It is so complex. And there's so many facets of this. I can only speak, obviously, my truth, but I've been talking to some of the people that I respect most online, that are very visible, very fearless seeming, very inspirational, ones I respect and love, a couple dozen almost. And we all share the same story. It just comes from different places. And some of us have, a pile up of all of them together, and some of us have just a couple. But I think that it even comes down to like being an infant, and that cycle of crying and being fed and having your needs met and then being able to sleep and when that cycle gets broken. So even just how what you had access to as an infant, pre-verbal, when you are not fed, when you cry or taken care of, you learn to not trust the world at that age. And so there's just so many reasons for it. And I feel like compassion is the most important thing if we're going to go forward with this type of discussion when it comes to body image and body acceptance and fat acceptance and all of that within our online communities. We all have these very complex stories that could start pre-verbally, and we don't know what other people's stories are. And I see a lot of judgment on others, and I'm not perfect. And of course, I'm sure I've contributed to this harsh conversations as well. But I think when we address other people, this is kind of where my brain is at. When we address other people, their stories, their decisions, we have to acknowledge that, if it wasn't an infant incident, it was a life in poverty. Or if it wasn't a life in poverty, it was the trauma of growing up in a fat body. If it wasn't the trauma of growing up in a fat body, it was something else. And, we all kind of go through, we have a lifetime of history behind us, and not much of it is kind when it comes to our bodies, simply because of the world we live in.
Mm-hmm. That is such a great point. And I think you're right. The discussion around this stuff can get sort of accusatory or toxic sometimes because people expect that body positivity or intuitive eating is going to come easily.
Yeah.
So, I'm curious, in your experience of poverty, like, what do you think people should understand about growing up with that lack of privilege that really gets in the way of your having an intuitive relationship with food?
I don't want to speak for everyone on how poverty affects your relationship with food, because I'm a white woman who had familial support around my childhood, and that's very different than someone who had no support, grew up, a different race in a different town in a different area. So I think it's very different. But what I can say is psychologically, never knowing if you're going to have enough will stick with you on a cellular level until I don't know how long it's going to stick with me, because I've just now at 30 started to look at it and address it and realize how intensely my nervous system believes that this world will not take care of me. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not sure how long it will take. I've been working on lots of other life issues, mostly interpersonal things. I do have several mental illness diagnoses. And so I've been doing therapy for 8 years with the same wonderful human. And I've made so much progress. And I feel like a different person than I was 8 years ago, obviously. But I'm very aware that I have so much further to go. So this is, for me, probably a lifelong journey of unlearning, relearning, changing my neural pathways to realize that I'm capable of taking care of myself and perhaps putting some trust where I've never been able to put trust before. If that makes any sense at all. Very vague.
Completely. No, it's, I mean, it's like, very similar to trauma recovery, right? From any sort of trauma.
Yeah, I think that's I love the word trauma because I feel like it's being used often and everywhere. And I'm thrilled. A lot of people are like, oh God, we keep using intersectionality and trauma and they're just buzzwords. But trauma is so important because I think we all experience it on some level. And so we can to some degree understand it in others. And I think that's really important. And trauma can compound, and depending on your identities and your experiences and your history, you can develop an extraordinary amount of trauma. But I love being able to talk about it. I'm so glad we have a word that most people understand. And yes, fat shaming is trauma. Poverty causes trauma. Any form of bigotry causes trauma. And so we can all kind of understand a little bit where we're all coming from. And I love that. So let's use trauma as much as we can. I'll say it a million times.
Yeah, I think that's so important to think about because it does really connect all of these disparate experiences that people might go through that have a very similar effect on the nervous system.
Yes.
Right? Like that's what the real lasting effects of trauma are, is that it shapes your nervous system and your neural pathways, like you said, to react to things that might not even be, the circumstances might be different now. And I also have a PTSD diagnosis, and I'm working through some complex trauma, and certainly don't have the trauma of living in a fat body or a non-white body, but plenty of other identities and kind of circumstances to create trauma, right? So it's like trauma can live in so many different people, so many different identities.
Yes. I will never forget when my therapist, this was years ago, she said, we live in a trauma-based civilization and it's only going to increase to be more so. And I was like, it was like, oh, okay, somebody understands. And as someone who still fights stigma around mental illness, I guess that's why I get so excited when we're able to talk about something very fundamental like trauma. That's why I'm excited, is because it's been so othered, and it's you, not me. I am normal, you're not. And so this trauma is this strange bonding term that we all experience, and it connects the mind and body, which is another thing that our world struggles and has always struggled to do. And we see the physical repercussions of mental trauma, and we see the mental repercussions of physical trauma. And so it's really connecting. Anyways, this is why I get so excited.
That's such a brilliant point. I hadn't thought about it in quite that way before, but that's exactly it, right? It affects our mind and body, and it connects them in these strange ways.
Yeah. Okay, I'm done ranting about how wonderful the word trauma is. We can move on.
Yes. Oh, I love it. Well, so it's interesting too to think about all the different kinds of trauma that people experience, right? And that certain types of trauma and certain identities don't experience the same sort of recurring trauma on a daily basis that, maybe others do, right? So like living in a fat body in a fatphobic society is something that causes a great deal of trauma for people, maybe acute sort of moments of trauma in childhood or whenever in life, right? But then there's this sort of constant re-triggering of the trauma and re-traumatizing and new events causing more trauma. So I'm curious to hear you speak to like the process of recovering from the trauma around living in your body in this society, and what you've found helpful in terms of like clapping back to all of these triggers that we have living in diet culture.
Well, I used to think my politics around bodies, it's changed a lot in the last 5 years. And I think that's natural, and I think it's good. And I think if someone were to start at the beginning and then never move forward in 5 years, that might be concerning. Mm-hmm. So I'm okay with it, even though it feels a little strange to look back and see my old, things I was so convinced of 5 years ago. And that's okay. I think it's a natural process. But I used to really feel that you could pep talk your way out of anything. And I think I was really into optimism, even though on my good days, I'm mildly optimistic. My mom is the most like naturally optimistic person I know. And I'm like, where did that get lost in our genetics? I really wish I had that. I'll just call myself a realist. And now I realize that it's great to have positive wants, wishes, and affirmations, but that's not necessarily going to fix society. And I think we have to look at that. I think a really interesting example of this that's very current right now is Roxane Gay and her new book, Hunger. And there's a lot of controversy, disappointingly so, within body communities about hunger. Have you had a chance to read it yet?
I started it. I am listening to it on audiobook, and I'm probably about 6 chapters in. I will say it's causing me some feelings that it's hard to get through, because
yes,
I'm a survivor of sexual assault as well, and so I kind of have to be careful what I take in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good job. Good job. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a really interesting narrative to look at because no one else is Roxanne Gay, right? And I was watching when it came out, and there was some, not everywhere, but there was some lash out against a fat body writing about not liking their fat body, about distancing themselves from their fat body with food, about being generally unhappy in a fat body when, and the point of view is kind of understandable. It's like, look, we've been fighting against this our whole life. Like this narrative, it feels detrimental. But the reality is that narrative is just as important. And for me right now, I would say, if not more, because it's not happening within fat circles very often that are working towards body liberation. Even more important because it shows the full scope of feelings and experiences around fat bodies. And of course, Roxanne has a super tragic history as well as intersecting identities that are incredibly oppressive. And she also really nails this point of, I wish I had it out in front of me, but she talks about, logically, I know that the beauty myth is bullshit and diet culture is bullshit. Like, I'm a feminist. I understand these ideologies. And yet the world is not. And that's the world that I live in. And she makes this really fascinating point of basically, more than likely within her lifetime, the world is not going to suddenly embrace fat people. She needs to think about herself and her life and her happiness instead of, becoming a martyr for the cause and trying to wait for society to get its shit together. And I think that's a really realistic way to look at life. I think Ashley Nell-Tipton is a great example as well. I know her personally. I love her. She's a genuine, incredible, kind, authentic person who has smashed a lot of ceilings in the fashion world. She has done a lot and has put, size in department stores. And there was a lot of backlash against her weight loss surgery as well. And I think we have to look at the fact that we're not Ashley. And a lot of people, I can't believe I'm saying this on your podcast, which is going to go so far. It's so controversial. And I feel like it really shouldn't be. Here's how I feel about weight loss surgery and Ashley Nell-Tipton. Ashley Nell-Tipton is an incredible human. She has broken down a million barriers on her own and has given the plus size community size clothing in department stores, along with an amazing person to kind of look up to just as a human. She's kind, she's funny, she is a plus size woman of color that has purple hair and is a fashion designer, and we just love her. And so I can see why people were let down by Ashley's decision to get weight loss surgery and then to publicly talk about it in a very positive way, which I actually really applaud. I think if we're going to do something like that, I think we need to be open about it. I think, pretending like it doesn't happen is kind of counterintuitive. But I also think that there was this whole, isn't it sad that Ashley did this? Isn't it sad that Ashley bought into diet culture? Isn't it sad? Isn't it sad? And kind of taking the responsibility. So if we zoom out for a second, we're looking at one woman versus an industry that is made up of billions and billions of dollars that has been around for centuries, that has centuries of rhetoric, and pitting them against each other. And then when the woman decides to participate in diet weight loss culture, we blame the person and we just target her instead of saying, wow, that was a really unfair fight. That could not be more skewed. Mm-hmm. And so we target the person and we're like, you failed. You were not strong enough. You could have been braver. You could have held on longer. And for ourselves, maybe we can make those judgments, but we don't know Ashley's story. And I think that we need to take the responsibility and really hold the diet industry, the media, the beauty. We need to hold those industries accountable instead. And we can be personally disappointed. Of course we can. We are allowed to feel feelings. That is not something I ever want people to stop doing. But I think what gets scary is when we start to publicly drag those people for failing. Because like Roxanne says, I don't see the system changing in my lifetime and I need to take care of myself. And I haven't talked to Ashley about this decision. And so I will never put words in her mouth. But I think, we could look at Gabor Sidibe and say, she came so far. She did so many amazing things. Maybe that was the stopping point of success, unless she kind of assimilated, gained some body currency by becoming smaller so she could continue to go and make money. And I'm all about powerful women changing the world and getting their money. Like I totally support that. And so the sad part is not that Ashley gave in. The sad part is not that Ashley bought into diet culture. Ashley can make whatever decisions she wants, and she's a grown-ass adult. The sad part is that she will be rewarded by society for doing so. I think that's where the sadness for me comes in. The sadness is that it will totally fucking work, and she will continue to move forward and be rewarded and covered by a million different media platforms and have more opportunities, and all because her body will continually to get smaller and fit into what we require of women. And the fact that that reward system is still in place is, for me, the saddest part. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes complex, right? Because you're like, well, if we keep having these really famous figures buying into this diet culture, then how are we supposed to change the visibility and what's being seen? And I don't have all the answers. I really don't. And I wish I did. I have more questions than answers. But what I do know is that body autonomy is absolutely necessary, because when you take away any piece of that, you're going down a slippery slope. Body autonomy for me, it just has to be that hard line. You get to make whatever decision you want. And I want to just also be extra clear and reiterate that people are allowed to have whatever feelings they want. And how can we not, right? Like seeing someone, I watch the grief over celebrities that die online, and it's like, wow, there's so much. I don't feel as strongly as many people do when celebrities die, but I see the mourning and grief online. And I feel like that's so fair. Like, people mean so much to us, especially in a world where there are not many powerful fat women. To watch someone we look up to, we gain nonverbal permission from, even just to exist, to watch that person transition to the dark side is what it feels like, is devastating. I get that. I really do. And I have to admit that I've been let down by people in my own mind, but that doesn't change the actual fact that people have to be able to make their own decisions. And we need to find a way to process that ourselves without lashing out at them to the point where they're sobbing in their room because, thousands of people have written the worst possible reactionary responses to their personal decision. So it's complicated.
Oh, it's so complicated. And those are such important points to bring up, because I think body autonomy is such a core of the body acceptance movement and the fat acceptance movement and health at every size. Like, that is a foundation on which these things rest, right? That we all have the right to do whatever we want with our bodies. And I think, to me, the thing that I usually will sort of add in there that Virgie Tovar has said, and we discussed this a little bit on her recent episode, was that people have the right to do whatever they want with their bodies, but they can't do whatever they want and call it body positive or call it fat acceptance or call it health at every size. Like, there is a definition of those things, right? Especially, body positive is a super problematic term, but like, say, fat acceptance. Like, if you do end up going over to what I do kind of feel too is the dark side, but again, that's every person's right to make their own decisions. And we live in a culture that puts so much pressure on people to conform in that way that, of course, we're going to have a lot of people fall prey to it and not be able to carry the mantle of being like a body image hero, because that is a real burden to bear as well. So we have that, but Joni Edelman is the person I'm thinking of, right? With sort of initially trying to paint what she was doing in pursuing intentional weight loss as body positive. That's where I think it gets super confusing and tricky. And we just have to say, like, well, no, she's totally allowed to do what she wants with her body, but that's not actually body acceptance, right? That's not having body acceptance. It's doing a different thing. And you can be on board with the ideals of these movements to some extent and then make a different choice for yourself. And that's totally your right, right? Everybody's right. But to then sort of be like, well, no, what I did is still body positive. That's where it like scrambles the mind. You know, it feels like gaslighting. That's Virgie's point. It feels like gaslighting when people say that an action that's clearly not accepting of their body, that clearly is sort of doing what diet culture has been pressuring them to do all along, to then call that action body acceptance, fat acceptance, body positive, whatever, is a misnomer.
It's interesting. You just brought up like 7 landmines in 1 minute. I have conflicting feelings about, we do have to take it in a case-by-case basis, don't we? Because there is no giant brush that we can paint everyone with. And we want to. As humans, we're like, for some reason, we're like, we want the quickest, fastest diet plan, please. And then when it's not that, it's like, we want the top 3 things to do to love your body, please. And so, you know, we want it to be simple, and it's not. As far as Joni goes, I think that's a pretty good example. I thought a lot about Joni and written about Joni privately, not yet published. But I think that's a great example of, again, talking to Ijoma about this particular situation and others like it. It's kind of one of those things that I just mentioned, like, call it, own it, and then live your life. So I didn't see the calling it and owning it on Joni's side. I don't think she really does believe that it isn't anything other than body positivity. But I also think that shines a huge light on the problematic labels we keep throwing all over the place. And there's so many of them at this point that whenever I go and I speak in public, I'm like, body, whatever the fuck this is. Like, I don't know what to call it anymore because I don't identify with, you know, it's so messy and gray. And so you have people like Virgie who are black and white all over the place, like absolutely no weight loss, absolutely no diet culture, absolutely not XYZ. And I don't find that to be a great model because I feel like there's no flexibility to be human within that model. And then you have people like Joni, which I don't know if that's a great, 180 degree opposite, but everything is body positive, including sharing numbers on the web and talking about weight loss and being how it's wonderful. So I don't really subscribe to either of those. I think I have to sit somewhere very uncomfortably in the middle where there is room for nuance and conversation, and there's no landing pad, which goes very against the quickest diet and quickest way to love my body, because there are no very clear definitions or rules, or this is a list of yeses and this is a list of no's. I can't sit there because I've seen too many exceptions. And I think, Ashley is still fat. She's very tall. She's very boxy. And even if she were to lose a ton of weight, she would still be a fat woman of color kicking ass in this world. And I still support her, and I still support all plus women who exist in these very large bodies in this world that is unkind. And so I wish I had more answers for you. I don't. All I know is that the script, here's how I will describe it. In the fat positive realm, we are fighting against an anti-fat script. We're fighting against a script that has been around for a long ass time that says that fat bodies are unworthy, disgusting, lazy, second-class citizens. And that is not a script that we want to live in. That is not a script that I want to live in. That is a script that no one deserves to live in. But to flip that script and live in a very limited black and white version of that script, it is 180 degrees. And it is countering this horrible world that we live in. But it's still a script. And a script is not freedom. And so I don't want to exist in a script anymore. I want to be able to have really hard conversations about the nuances around fat bodies and diet culture. And, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, well, how much do you get to change your body and still be body positive? And some very silly examples are like, I have, but not really, I have lots of tattoos. I altered my body. But that's considered alternative and reclamation on this side of the script. So it's okay. If I shave my PCOS hair, is that buying into beauty culture? If I get it lasered, is that buying into beauty culture? Do I have to let it just grow in order to be fully accepting? Anyways, what are your thoughts? I'm curious because this is just something that is so intangible. It's not really being talked about a whole bunch. It's not really that popular, to be honest, in online spaces. However, in those dozens of conversations I was telling you about, we're not having those conversations because it doesn't feel safe. And having them one-on-one is really powerful. And I'm feeling that a lot of us feel the same way. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Totally. I mean, so many thoughts on all this stuff. And I will say, as a person living in a thin body, like, who am I to even say, right?
Well, I'm asking.
Yeah,
I'm curious. No. You talk to a lot of people.
Yes, I do. I know. And I mean, I think, my personal experience is one thing, but my, experience of talking to people and working with clients is a different thing. So like from that experience, I have a little more insight maybe that I could draw from. But I also think, to your point about the sort of analogies of body hair or buying into the patriarchal beauty standards in some way, right? I've thought about that a lot in my personal life because, I wear makeup, I shave my legs, I, do things that patriarchy tells me to do, right? In a lot of ways. And it's not just a choice, like the choice feminism line on that is to say like, oh, well, that's your choice. You could do it or not do it. And whatever you want to do, it's feminist, which to me, it's not that really, because like it's so much easier in a patriarchal society to shave my legs and to wear makeup. And I'm not going to get called, people aren't going to think I'm like a child or really tired if I go out with makeup. Whereas if I go out without makeup, that those are the sort of judgments that have been put on me, like you look really young. What are you doing in this space? Or you look really tired. Are you okay? Are you healthy? Like, so I think there are definitely certain ways in which buying in a little bit to beauty culture helps you get shit done in the world.
Of course.
Right? Like,
obviously.
Yes. That's like our way of being seen and accepted in spaces where we wouldn't be if we did the totally radical thing all the time. So what you're talking about in terms of like weight loss surgery or trying to change your body in some way that might fit the cultural ideal more is kind of analogous. It's kind of the same thing, but it makes me uncomfortable because I'm like, well, I think I want to be a voice and create a space for a totally different way of thinking about bodies that really says all bodies are acceptable just as they are. And even if you didn't shave your legs, and even if you didn't wear makeup, and even if you are in a fat body and don't do anything to change it, like that's okay. That should be celebrated. You deserve to accept yourself and love yourself, whatever body you show up in. And thinking of this analogy of like pressure, there's so much pressure coming in on the outside that like we're sort of crumbling under it, right? Like each individual can crumble under the weight of all that. And so to create sort of a bubble in a space that has its own pressure pushing back to like maybe give the people within this bubble a little bit of breathing room and ability to like stay whole is really important, right? Like that's what the sort of hard line I think about this movement is this attempt to create a bubble with its own reverse pressure. But I totally get that that's also, it's very black and white, right? And it's existing on a binary of you're either, all in with diet culture or you're against all of it completely. I'm just reading this book called Originals by Adam Grant. He's like a business researcher. And it talks about people who are nonconformists shaping the world and making big changes through social movements. And his argument is that, we need people who are the real radicals, and then people who are kind of Trojan horses, he calls them, who like buy in enough to the status quo that they can take the radical ideas into the spaces that they wouldn't be able to go otherwise and sort of mainstream them.
Oh my God, so many feelings.
Right? Yeah, it's so complex thinking about that, because in some senses I'm like, oh, I see how I'm sort of a Trojan horse in some ways in this space.
Is he talking about allies, or is he really talking about mainstreaming? If we were to take the body positive movement, is he talking about mainstreaming fat bodies, or is he talking about thin bodies taking, because they are accessible, taking the message? Because those are very different things.
Very different things. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, he doesn't write about bodies at all. His arguments on this was like, yeah. So he's talking about like women's suffrage. That's the realm in which he created this analogy. And he was talking about how like some of the really radical suffragists were not making headway in getting suffrage accepted on a mainstream level and getting political power behind this movement. And it was people who were more the Trojan horses that kind of ushered it in and sort of got it across the finish line to become law. So I think the sort of analogy, I mean, I'm a thin person, right? I'm not someone who exists in a larger body and can be sort of visible doing cool shit in a larger body. But I think my role is to highlight the voices of people in larger bodies, to bring a lens on this issue that, as a person who is in a thin body and also white and has some conventional attractiveness and has a bunch of letters after my name, like educational privilege and professional privilege, I can reach people that might not listen to someone who didn't have all that stuff, right? Which sucks. Like, it sucks that gives me privilege. And I wish we lived in a society where people would be taken seriously and have their stories listened to, whatever body they existed in, whatever amount of education they had, whatever their skin color was, et cetera. But the fact that we live in a society right now that doesn't means that my role here can be being a Trojan horse of these messages, I guess, and helping them reach people, bringing these concepts to a wider audience. I think that's something that fat acceptance activists and allies can do together.
Yeah. Okay, a couple things. One, I want to talk about the bubble that you talked about a little while back to create the safe space from the outside pressures. And then I want to talk about the mainstreaming of body positivity. Is that okay?
Totally. Yeah.
Okay. So I think I'm just going to repeat myself because I think it's really important. I don't have all the answers. I'm just one human who rests in a very gray area. So this is not gospel. I'm not telling people this is like the right way. I'm just telling you my feelings about this. This bubble that we create is necessary. And that's where I want you to know that my politics around bodies seem very catawampus to a lot of people, I think, at this point, because they're conflicting. But I don't think it's because they fight against each other. I think it's because we don't have a space for them to coexist in yet. And I want that space to exist someday. I see both sides. So I want a space, and we'll talk about this with mainstreaming of body positivity. I don't know why I'm not able to say positivity today. Maybe I've said it too many times in my life. First of all, let's just put this out here. I don't like the term body positivity. There's so many different words now for this very generalized conversation we're having. The one I have found that works for me is body liberation. And it's very, very different in my mind. The definition behind body liberation has a lot to do with resting within that gray area. I don't really subscribe to body love, even though it's something that I used for a really long time. And I like the concept of body love as it stands, but it has been co-opted so many times that it's no longer something that I even remotely see like the original meaning in. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm, totally.
So, and body positivity and BOPO and like all that shit. Like, I don't know what that means anymore because it has been scattered across a million platforms by a million people. So I'm going to just go with body liberation. That's what I believe in. That's what my blog says now. So when it comes to body liberation in this bubble, we have to have safe spaces, right? We have to have places where we can go. We need sanctuaries. And I get it because I have gained, I don't know how many pounds, a significant amount of weight to the point where people look at me differently in the last 4 years. And I was fat before. So I am beyond acceptable online fat. And it's really hard when thin people get fat shamed to not use numbers and put fat in a social context because we call everybody fat all the time. But we'll just say that take pictures of me at Walmart fat. I am middle seat is always left empty in Southwest boarding fat. I am people take me less seriously when I lecture than they did 4 years ago fat. So that's kind of where I am. So when I enter the world, it is not nice for me. And I have so much fucking privilege. And just because of my size, it is trauma upon trauma upon trauma, like microaggression against fat people. And so it sucks. And of course, I want to have this community where they get it, they experience it, and it is the opposite of what I experience in real life because the world is not changing quick enough. If anything, I think it's just reinventing its horrible self in horrible new ways. So I get that we want to keep everything that triggers any form of feeling lesser than outside of our spaces. However, I think that we have kind of shot ourselves in the foot when it comes to the spaces we have created for the most part. At least that's what I've been seeing. And of course, it depends on who you interact with online. But here's an example. We're not having all the conversations. We're only having the ones that are the 180-degree flipped script. And I think that's problematic. I heard of a friend who is part of a radical group of fat babes, and one of their friends had chosen to get weight loss surgery. I don't know the reasoning behind it. It doesn't matter. She chose to get weight loss surgery and was so terrified of telling her friends and the judgment and anger that she didn't. She didn't tell any of her radical fat babe friends what decisions she had made. And so, that's really tragic, of course, not being able to have that conversation. But then what happened is she died of complications in her home and no one knew. And they found her 3 days later. And that to me is what happens when we're not it gives me chills. It makes me want to cry. I have so many intense feelings about that person specifically and everyone like her. And that's what happens when we do not have gray area conversations. So to keep everything out and draw that hard line, to me, that is what happens. And it's not a positive thing. So then it becomes, well, how do we have these really hard conversations in a safe space? And the reality is that right now it's really difficult. And the reason that there was so much backlash against Joni, Ashley, anyone, first of all, I want to just make sure that we are very clear that Ashley and Gabri Sidibe are women of color with unconventionally fat bodies who are in huge spotlights, and same with Roxanne Gay. And so those experiences, I just want to separate them from other conversations we're having, because that's a whole other narrative level story that most people within this online fat activism space can't identify with. So it's really scary to me, especially when we judge people that we don't understand all of what it's like to live in their body. Joni is a smaller fat. She's white. I think she more closely resembles a lot of the people who are vocal in this conversation. But anyways, again, talking to Ijoma Ulo, and I was like, oh my God, what are we going to do? This is just a mess. Everything's a mess. And the reality is that the reason it's a mess is because we are all so wounded. And this is not anything new. This is something I've been talking about for a long time. And I get it. So if we're on the front lines of fat activism, body liberation, body love, whatever, we're there because we've been harmed and we want the world to change. And we do not want other people to have to go through what we did, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's why we're doing it.
Yeah.
That means that we are basically walking open wounds because this shit is so real and it's so unfair and it is so harmful. And we have been targets for so long for whatever reason. This goes, with all movements, of course. And so the people fighting it's so unfair. The people fighting this, all of us, are wounded, hurt. We are fucking surviving in a world that doesn't want us to survive. We are not only doing that, we are also fighting for liberation from this bullshit that we've had to endure and has fucked us up. And so these are the people then reacting to Joni's comments, to Ashley's weight loss, to all of these other things. And we're all coming from this very triggered, reactionary, wounded space, which I think is why things escalate so fast. And it's understandable. It's totally understandable. Like, we have not been able to rest our entire life, right? Like, we live in a world that it's visual. They know we're not okay the second they look at us and they tell us so. So we're tired, we're wounded, we're, never rested. And I'm talking on like a cellular, like soul level. And so we're reacting. And so then it escalates and it becomes what looks to me as inefficient and unmanageable. And I'm going to just insert right here that all of this is okay. This is natural. This is what happens. This is real life. We are real people with real issues and oppression. And it is what it is for humans. And I have to allow humans to be humans. But what I'm saying is it's not exactly the best we can do, I think. I think we can somehow do better and heal more. And within these interviews that I did, the same thing came up. What's the solution to this problem of disposability within social justice circles and this escalation and this kicking people out of the club for making a mistake when we all make mistakes? And the answer is compassion, of course, empathy, but those are hard. So what we really need is therapy and healing. But that's a privilege. So, like, how do we get these huge masses of people access to therapy? Because therapy is elitist, really. I mean, to be able to go to therapy is not a luxury most people have. And so the answer from Ijoma and many others is that we need to become the therapists within our community. And that is not a new concept. This is something that most social justice movements have. Like, the communities becomes the healers. So we somehow need to transition from posting Instagram hate notes with knife emojis about a woman's decision to get weight loss surgery. We need to transition that into somehow working on our own healing and then offering healing to others. And you got me on how to do that. It's something I've been thinking about a lot because we need the healing within our communities. And then when we're able to kind of feel grounded in our communities, I think we'll be able to have these conversations a little easier. I am talking about like a utopian internet. I don't know how to make this happen, what it's going to take, but what I do know is what we have is not really working.
And I think it's a good point too that we're talking about the internet here. We're talking about people's reactions publicly. And that's something that is very different than how you react privately in your own life, right? So like having offline spaces where people can process feelings that come up and people can talk to someone who gets it about like the disappointment they feel when they see an icon of theirs get weight loss surgery or whatever. Like, I think we need to have spaces where people are allowed to process that stuff. And it's really hard to do that effectively and to get compassion and sort of holding and not trigger others or have people piling on when it's done online in sort of open forums, right? Like, that's
true.
A huge
Very
problem
true.
with the medium. And yet there is, I feel like a lot of people have said this to me, that like their body liberation community, to use your phrase, I love that, their body liberation community exists either solely or primarily online. And that they don't have people in their lives who get this stuff, right?
Exactly.
So that's kind of the double bind.
Yes, absolutely. And, to be honest, I have a hard time with the internet. It's inherently dehumanizing. It's caused a lot of wonderful things to happen into my life. Obviously, I'm very lucky, but it's also caused a lot of pain. But it's allowed me to meet people, individuals that I now text, call, and Skype. Because even me, I live in Tucson, Arizona, first of all. So this is not like the hub of body love necessarily. Although I do have, Jade Beal lives here. Do you know who she is?
Oh, yeah. I think I know her from your roundup of body activists years ago.
Yes.
So good.
She's a good friend of mine. I'm so lucky. But again, she's a thin woman who works with pregnancy and post-pregnancy body issues. So it's a little different. But the internet is rarely healing for me. It's the conversations I have with people one-on-one that are. And I really noticed that recently in kind of taking a step back. Writing a book is a really interesting thing because you disappear for a while, even though you're still writing about the stuff you normally would online, but you're in a vacuum, essentially.
Yeah, you're not sharing it out there with the people online.
There's no feedback or reactions. Yeah, it's kind of scary and kind of wonderful. But it was, and I was starting to feel really drained. I feel drained by the internet a lot. But getting a phone call from Denise Jolly, or I talked to Caleb Luna, and they restored everything in me. It's those one-on-one. So I'm just thinking out loud because this is not something I've thought about a lot before, but I don't know how it would be if people were to try to connect one-on-one with people they really identified with online. I don't know how much our community allows that to happen. As bloggers, you meet at blogger meetings and events and stuff, and that's kind of given to you. Finding the people that you can have more in-depth, less public conversations with sounds like a good solution. But it's obviously way more complicated than that.
Yeah. And I think it's hard to connect offline without those. That's sort of like a privilege, right? I think,
Right.
I have that privilege too, right? Of being a professional in this field and going to conferences and speaking and meeting other speakers and connecting with these people that I really want to talk to and have in my life, having a podcast, getting to call you, versus, you're one person, you have limited time. You're not going to be able to be friends with all the people who might want to be friends with you online or connect with you and have conversations about this stuff, right? So same with me, I don't have time, unfortunately. I barely can keep up with the friends I already have and meet new people and keep those connections going. It's very hard to, as individuals, right? We all have these pressures on us. We all have families or obligations or work or whatever it is. There's a lot we all have going on.
Yeah. I don't know how it's supposed to work, but I do know that what we're doing isn't working. Isn't that so helpful? Hey guys, we have a huge fucking problem. I don't know how to fix it, but I know it's a problem. But, that's where collectively, hopefully, we can start a conversation about how to do all this.
Right. And just recognizing there's a problem is the first step. I think it is important to sort of sit with that. Okay, this is not working. There is a lack. There's a need for a space to be able to have these kinds of conversations.
Yeah.
And hopefully, sitting with that lack will bring something up for someone.
Yeah.
Some creative ideas will start to come out of that.
I'll just put a shout out on your podcast that if anybody has thought about this or has some really great ideas on how to combine what we have with what we need, I would love to hear them. You can find me everywhere online. Find me, tell me, I would love to hear them.
Yeah. On this other point of the mainstreaming of body love or body acceptance or whatever the hell you want to call it, right? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that too.
It's been really interesting to watch. You were talking about the Trojan horse, and that's a perfect example of how my politics have changed in it's been almost 5 years. Oh my God, I think it's been 5 years. 5 years ago, I really, really believed that we needed to mainstream fat bodies by any means necessary. Water it down, make it palatable, get it out there because representation is really important. And I kind of half got my wish and it backfired. It completely backfired. Let me tell you why. Instagram has single platformedly changed this conversation. And it's really interesting to me. Instagram is fascinating for a million reasons. I've done a lot of studies on it recently. So Instagram has bred this new movement that I am going to call Lisa Frank Bopo. And by the way, Lisa Frank was from Tucson, and I used to stalk her house as a child.
Oh my God. Awesome. I loved her so much.
And there's nothing wrong with Lisa Frank stuff, right? We all love rainbows and cats and unicorns.
Totally.
And gumball machines and penguins that surf. It's really cute and wonderful. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I don't believe in a world void of happiness. I don't think we need to constantly eradicate happiness from our body advocacy. However, what Lisa Frank Bopo has done is centered thin white female bodies. And again, and so you have this, let's mainstream body acceptance. And it looked really great for a while. And I was like real excited. And to be honest, I'm to blame for some Lisa Frank Bopo. I preached Lisa Frank Bopo so hard for so long. But what that does is that further, what I have noticed, I shared with you that I am taken less seriously now that I've gained more weight. Mm-hmm. And this is very, very obvious. I lecture at universities, and the last year, I have been less apologetic about health and my explanation thereof. I have not padded it. I've destroyed the myths and presented alternative options in ways where I would have been a little less forceful before. And I am much fatter. And my question and answer sessions have gone from positive experiences to bafflingly dehumanizing experiences, where people will stand up and basically, essentially force me to prove on stage, after giving an hour-long lecture based on research by people much smarter than me, with citations and all of that, prove to them that I am worthy to exist.
Oh, God.
Oh, it sucks.
That sounds so painful.
It is really exhausting. I leave those very exhausted. And it comes with this, I believe everyone should love their bodies, but. And that is the statement that comes from Lisa Frank Bopo, because we are centering thin white bodies who are only talking about thin white bodies. And within that is inherent fat phobia. And there are a lot of eating disorder accounts. And I really believe, don't get me wrong, that everyone is dealing with shit. Like, I do not pretend like any person has it easy on this planet. You know, like we all have been targeted by diet, weight loss, and beauty industry issues. Like we all deal with them. It doesn't matter what you look like. Even people who have the most privilege, I call it body currency, those people still deal with body image issues. So I'm not invalidating that. What I am saying is that by just presenting themselves and not including other identities within their body positive, their Bopo, their Lisa Frank Bopo Instagram movement, further stigmatizes fat bodies, bodies of color, trans bodies, disabled bodies, aging bodies, all of the bodies. And the mainstreaming has, in my personal life, the mainstreaming has made it more difficult for me as a fat person. And so the solution, it's not that I'm anti-rainbows. Like, I love Lisa Frank, and I put rainbows and unicorn pool floaties in my Instagram stories all the time. The problem is not that necessarily. The problem is that we stop there. The problem is the world is comfortable there, so they stop there. And that is the issue. So do these Instagram accounts need to go away? No. People's stories are valid. You know, the Trojan horse part, some people need a nice pink little sparkly stepping stone in order to move further. Like, I'm going to scare the shit out of them. So they need a transition between hating their body and believing that the beauty myth lies and me. And then they need a stepping stone between me and Sonia Renee Taylor or whoever else is, you know, I'm just a middle person. And so we don't need to necessarily get rid of the accounts, but what we do need to do is include actual body issues in there. So we need to be, in every single body account, we need to be talking about fat and health and the myths there. We need to be talking about racism. We need to be talking about disabled representation. We need to be talking about trans issues. We need to be talking about aging issues. We need to be talking about people who don't fit into any of the fucking boxes we create, even within the body movement. And when we're not doing that, we're actively harming other people. And so that's my issue with Lisa Frank Bopo. I'll be writing about it so that's a little more clear. It feels really sad to me that it's become, and this is like not surprising, like the beauty myth, when people were like, I don't give a shit about makeup anymore, I want to be natural, a magazine created a nude makeup line so that they would rebuy in. It just looked differently. And so we are we're now selling inclusivity instead of using exclusivity. It's so similar and it's kind of gross.
Yeah, it is.
So to summarize, I don't want to invalidate anybody's experiences because it harms everyone. People's stories are important. And it's okay to use kittens and rainbows and unicorns, but we need to make sure that we go beyond that. We need to make sure we don't stop there. And I think that's the most important part. And the same goes for me as well. I'm not sitting here on a soapbox telling everyone that I'm better than they are. I have work to do as well. I am a white female who maybe is fat, real fat, but I went into a courtroom yesterday to defend a ticket I got. And the single fact that I lived through being pulled over and was able to go sit in a social justice courtroom in 2017 is a fucking privilege that people are not afforded. And that is mind-boggling and more fucked up than I won't scream. I won't scream on your podcast.
No, I'm with you.
I sit with an extraordinary amount of privilege. And so for me as well, I cannot just be focusing on fat bodies, as important as they are. I also need to be addressing all of the other issues that are intertwined because my oppression is your oppression and everyone's oppression is connected. And when we are not focusing on that, when we are not linking ourselves together, when we're not recognizing that we're all dealing with trauma to bring it full circle and that we all need to be each other's healers, we're not going to really make that much progress.
That is so well said. Fuck yeah to that, because body liberation, I mean, when you say body liberation, it really does encapsulate all of it, right? It's the liberation of bodies, period, not bodies that fit into a certain box, right? That are up to a certain size or a certain color skin or able-bodied as opposed to having disabilities or whatever. Like it's all of it. Body acceptance, liberation, etc. has to be all bodies, or else it's nothing, or else it's meaningless.
It's meaningful for one kind of person, and chances are that person already has some support.
Yeah.
Body liberation also allows people to not love their body, and I think that's really important. I think that when we tell people the ultimate goal is to love their body, that puts another form of pressure on a person, especially living within a society where they must exist that tells them that they should not. And we've talked about David and Goliath essentially before, and that's just really unfair. You don't have to love your body in order to live your best life. In fact, for me, my goal is for my body to just exist. Like existing is victory, and not letting my body hinder the way I perceive and live my life is the ultimate goal. Kind of to ignore my body at some point in a very balanced, healing, amazing way. Like, hey, this is just the thing that lets me engage with life. That's my goal. Not to obsessively love it, not to see it ranked on the beauty standard chart, not any of that. Not anymore. It is to live fucking life and let my body do that. And that's kind of where the liberation for me comes from. Liberated from everything, including standards of, you need to not hate so we're told to hate our body and we do that real well. And then we're told we have to love our body, and that's a struggle. And we end up spending so much energy within there. And I just feel like body liberation is perfect. It's existing is victory enough. And sometimes that's all we can do. So I'm all for body liberation.
I love that. And yeah, to have your thoughts about your body get out of your way so that you can just be in your body and live your life. That's the ultimate goal.
As much as possible, because we still have a world that is trying to hinder us, and we don't need to act like a dog pile on top of that, And systemic issues it's a long game. It's a long fight. It's a huge, huge, huge thing to tackle. And I work on it every day. And there are so many people who work on dismantling this fucked up system every day, but it's not happening today. And so the only thing we can do is liberate our thoughts from any idea or expectation that we need to be a certain thing, whatever that is. And so, the mental liberation, and I am going to just add in here that having a mental illness makes that even more complicated, right? So we have to acknowledge ableism in this as well. But that's really the only thing that we can try and change. That's really the only thing we have the most control over within this moment, is releasing ourselves of expectations and finding liberation.
I love that. Well, tell us about your new book and
oh my God,
what that's about.
I talked so much about what I've been processing in my book. The book is called, I believe it was tentative, might still be. It's called Land Whale. And I'm really excited about it. It's an essay memoir thing that's coming out in spring. And it's very different. I thought it was going to be easier to write than the last one. It really did. I thought, I've written a book before. This is going to be, I know the process. I'm working with the same editor. It's going to be great. It's been the most painful thing to write, because basically you're uncovering trauma. And then a few paragraphs later, you have to dig 7 layers deeper and then make it pretty.
Yeah.
And with words. And you're at that point, you're just sobbing on your keyboard and you don't have any words. So it's been very exhausting. My pro tip to anyone is, if you ever write a memoir and get a offer contract, triple it and then sign it, and it will probably be worth it. So that's for future me, if I ever write another book that's a memoir.
That's a great tip.
But, there's funny things, and there's really sad, hard things, and there's I don't fucking know what I'm talking about things. Basically, what we talked about today is a little snippet, just the complexity of being a fat person. And childhood, growing up, college, growing up Mormon, that was a trip and a half. That added a lot of other interesting body attitudes that, that shit's weird.
That's so fascinating. I can't wait. So spring of 2018?
Yeah.
Awesome. And then where can people find you in the meantime?
I'm still blogging. There's nothing that makes you want to blog more than having a book deadline. You're you know what I could be doing with my time right now instead of doing this deadline? I could be writing about swimsuits on the internet. So,
yes.
I can be found on my blog, which is themilitantbaker.com. I just wrote a post about not always loving your body, and posted some photos in a swimsuit that I was not feeling. And you never really know with the internet. You'd think you would, but what hits and what is a miss. And this exploded. And I think people really identify with I've been working on this for years and still have a hard time. So I blog there. And if you want some awesome thought-provoking articles, you can go to my Facebook. If you want pictures of my dog and outfits, you can go to my Instagram. And all of my social media is on top of my blog. You can find me everywhere.
Oh, I love it. I'll put a link to that in the show notes so people can find you and read your blog. And of course, many folks already do and love it. So I'm really so happy to have been able to chat with you and have these difficult conversations. I think this is so important to talk about. So thank you for sharing your perspective. And I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
So that is our show for today. Thanks so much to Jes Baker for being here and sharing her story. And I'm really curious to hear all of your thoughts and feedback on this episode. So come share with us in the Food Psych Listener Crew Facebook group. You can find it by going to christyharrison.com/community. That'll redirect you to the Facebook group page, and you can click to request to join. And you can find full show notes for this episode, including all of the resources we discussed, at christyharrison.com/112. That's for episode 112, which this is. ChristyHarrison.com/112. If you like the podcast and you want to help us reach more people who need to hear these great conversations, you can leave us a rating and review and share on iTunes. So sharing, rating, and reviewing really help bring us up in the iTunes rankings, which thereby helps more people discover the podcast and helps me be the sort of Trojan horse, I guess, in the health podcast space, because we're really high up in the health rankings right now, alongside all of these other really diety podcasts. And when people discover this podcast, when they're just browsing through there, it could be a portal into a new way of thinking about health and bodies and body liberation, really, that they might never have stumbled upon before if they didn't see it in these iTunes charts. So the iTunes charts are important for spreading the message. So help us get out there by sharing this episode on iTunes. You can do that by just clicking the little 3 dots at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen if you're listening on your phone, or in a little button at the right-hand side of the episode title if you're looking at your computer on iTunes. The music you're hearing behind me now is by a band called AWOL, and the track is called Food, used under the Creative Commons license. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.
Stupid or scared, no work in the kitchen now. Who put you there in that perfect position now? Bullies want your food, and you ain't really beat. Have you ever